I wasn't looking for women when I started this investigation. I was researching something much simpler: photographic cropping patterns in 19th century archive images. The kind of technical work that puts most people to sleep. Who's in the frame? Who's at the edge? Who got cut out in the print? Standard archival methodology. The kind of research you do on a Tuesday and forget by Thursday. But then I noticed something that I couldn't unfold. In photograph after photograph from the 1860s through the 1890s, formal portraits, civic events, construction site records, institutional documentation, something was missing. Not something small, not a detail. Something structural. Something that should have been everywhere and simply wasn't. Women. Not absent the way women are absent from military photographs or mining records. Absent in a different way. Present at the edges. Cut from the frame. Appearing in cropped versions of images where the uncropped original, when I could find it, showed them standing in positions of authority, wearing garments we have no explanation for, in front of buildings we've never been able to accurately date. Once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. And once you see what I'm about to show you, you won't be able to either. Let me start with a single photograph, because that's always where it starts. A formal civic portrait from a municipal archive in the American Midwest. The image shows a group of officials standing in front of what the caption describes as a newly constructed courthouse. Standard documentation, the kind of image you'd pass over in 30 seconds, except look at the women in the frame. There are 3 of them standing slightly behind the men, dressed in clothing that doesn't match anything we call Victorian fashion. The fabric has a geometric precision to it. The embroidery along the collar follows a pattern, a repeating angular motif that appears in decorative stonework on buildings across 4 different continents that we've dated to the same approximate period. I spent 6 weeks trying to identify that pattern. It doesn't appear in any Victorian textile catalogue I could locate. It doesn't appear in any fashion history database. It appears identically reproduced on the facades of administrative buildings in St. Petersburg, on the interior arches of public halls in Buenos Aires, on the carved panels of municipal structures in Melbourne, buildings that, according to official history, were designed and constructed entirely independently by different architects in different decades for different governments. The same pattern on their clothing. In 1887, that was the crack. And once a crack appears, you start to see where it leads. So I went looking for more. And here is what I found. Not in one archive, not in one country, but across dozens of collections in 7 countries on 4 continents. The pattern repeats with a precision that coincidence cannot explain. In formal photographs from the 1850s through 1890s, the same 4 decades when Tartaria disappears from maps, when the mud flood events cluster, when the giants vanish from newspaper reports, women appear in a specific recurring context that historians have never adequately explained. They're not in domestic settings, they're not in the backgrounds of family portraits, they're in administrative buildings, standing beside infrastructure, present at civic foundations and institutional openings, photographed in locations that our official history describes as exclusively male spaces. And yet there they are, formally dressed, formally positioned, in roles that the caption never names. The Russian Imperial Archives hold 34 photographs from the 1860s through 1880s, showing women in what appears to be administrative dress. A uniform, almost, but one that matches no known institutional clothing of that period. They appear in government buildings. They appear in railway documentation photographs. They appear at infrastructure openings. The captions describe them as wives, relatives, companions. But wives don't stand at the centre of an official photograph. Relatives don't receive their own framing. Companions don't appear in infrastructure documentation in formal institutional clothing, holding what appear to be architectural documents. In the Library of Congress collection, and I want to be specific because you can verify this yourself, there are photographs from the 1870s and 1880s showing women in American civic buildings, not attending events, not watching ceremonies, standing in working spaces, in administrative offices, beside what appear to be drafting tables, in rooms that the official record says women did not occupy in any professional capacity until decades later. The explanation we're offered: they were visitors, curious onlookers, wives of architects brought to see the progress. In every photograph, in every country, in every archive, the same explanation, applied uniformly, without investigation. France, Germany, Australia, the United States, Brazil, the same type of woman, the same type of location, the same institutional erasure, applied with the same systematic thoroughness. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns like this don't emerge from accident. But before we get to the scale, there's something I need to lay out first. Because the photographs alone don't tell the full story. The clothing does. I spent 3 months cross-referencing textiles. That sounds like an absurd sentence. I understand that. But stay with me. Because what came out of that research is something I haven't been able to explain away. And believe me, I tried. Victorian women's clothing is extraordinarily well documented. There are pattern books, trade catalogues, fashion plates, dressmaker records, import manifests. We know what women wore in 1870. We know what they wore in 1885. We know what fabrics were available, what dyes were in production, what embroidery styles were fashionable, in which regions of which countries. This is not a gap in the historical record. This is one of the most comprehensively documented aspects of 19th century material culture. And yet, in photograph after photograph from the archives I was examining, not fashion photographs, not portraits commissioned for aesthetic purposes, but working documentation, civic records, institutional images, the women appear in garments that don't match the catalogue. Not approximately, not close but slightly different, not off by a decade or a region, simply not present in any record of what was being produced and sold in that period. The geometric embroidery pattern I mentioned earlier, I eventually found a match. Not in a textile archive, not in a fashion history database, in a stonework analysis paper published in 1908 by a German architectural historian documenting decorative elements on pre-19th century administrative buildings across Central Europe and Northern Asia. He catalogued the pattern as a recurring motif in what he called structures of uncertain origin, buildings that appeared in regions without corresponding construction records, without documented architects, without the usual paper trail that accompanies large-scale civic construction. He catalogued the pattern. He noted its geographic spread. He observed that it appeared with remarkable consistency across culturally unconnected regions. And then he moved on, filed it as a decorative convention, an aesthetic coincidence. But here's what he didn't ask, and what I couldn't stop asking once I noticed it. If the pattern appears on buildings across Central Europe, Russia, and Northern Asia, buildings we now associate with Tartarian construction, and the same pattern appears on the clothing of women photographed in administrative contexts in America in the 1870s and 1880s, then what is the connection? You don't inherit an architectural motif on your clothing by accident. Clothing patterns carry meaning. They carry identity. They carry institutional affiliation. The women weren't wearing a fashion trend. They were wearing a uniform, and uniforms mean institutions. Institutions mean roles. Roles mean functions that someone at some point decided needed to be performed, and then at some later point decided needed to disappear. There's a category of historical document that almost nobody looks at: institutional inventory records, the lists that administrative buildings kept of their contents, furniture, equipment, supplies, personnel, not the grand official records, the mundane ones, the ones that tell you how many chairs were in a room and what the room was used for. I started pulling these wherever I could find them. Municipal archives in the American Midwest, city records from administrative centres in the UK, civic documentation from Australian colonial era buildings. Whatever survived, whatever was digitised, whatever hadn't been reclassified or removed. And in these records, in the background noise of institutional administration, in the parts of the archive that nobody reads because they seem too boring to matter, I found something that shouldn't be there. Repeated references across multiple institutions in multiple countries to a category of administrative personnel that the official record has never acknowledged. Not male administrators, not clerks or janitors or groundskeepers. Women, in roles that have no official name. In an 1871 inventory of a Cincinnati municipal building, there's a reference to the upper administrative suite maintained for female oversight personnel. The suite consists of 4 rooms. It has its own separate entrance. It's listed as having been in continuous use since the building's construction. A building dated officially to 1847. Female oversight personnel in 1847 in Cincinnati, with their own dedicated administrative suite. I searched for any official record of who these women were, what their roles were, who appointed them, what they oversaw. Nothing. The personnel records for that suite don't exist. The role isn't referenced in any official staffing document. The suite itself was converted to storage in 1911, right on schedule, right in that same window. And the inventory entry is the only record that it ever existed. In a Leeds city archive, there's a reference in an 1863 building maintenance log to the women's records chamber requiring roof repair. The repair was authorised. The chamber is described as being on the 3rd floor of a building that official city history says was used exclusively for male civic administration. Women's records chamber, 3rd floor, 1863, Leeds. What records? Whose records? Why a dedicated chamber? The maintenance log doesn't say. The building's official history doesn't mention it. When I contacted the archive directly, I was told the relevant personnel files from that period were not available, not destroyed, not missing, not unknown, not available. I found 17 references like this across 9 countries. 17 moments where the mundane administrative record accidentally preserves evidence of something the official history forgot to erase. Women in dedicated administrative spaces. Women in oversight roles. Women with their own institutional infrastructure inside buildings that history tells us they had no role in. 17 accidents. At what point does an accident become a pattern? At what point does a pattern become evidence? I'll let you decide that. Now here's where it gets harder to explain away. We've covered the giant photographs in previous videos. The men photographed at heights between 8 and 10 feet, standing in formal contexts, appearing in the same administrative buildings we've traced across the Tartarian architectural record. But here's what I hadn't looked at carefully enough until this investigation. The women in these photographs. Not all of them, but enough. A consistent subset appearing across the same archives in the same time period. Women whose proportions, when you measure them against the documented architectural features in the background, cannot be reconciled with average human height. There's a photograph in the Smithsonian Archive collection, or rather there was, documented in a 1922 catalogue and now listed as location unknown, described in that catalogue as showing a woman of remarkable stature, standing beside a door frame in what was identified as a municipal building in Ohio. The catalogue entry notes her height as approximately 8 feet and describes her clothing as formal, institutional dress of unidentified type. Remarkable stature. Formal, institutional dress. Unidentified type. And then, location unknown. This is the same archive that lost hundreds of giant skeleton specimens in the early 20th century. The same institution that categorizes and files and then cannot locate. The pattern of disappearance follows the pattern of everything else we've traced. Acknowledgement, documentation, then systematic absence. But the photographs that survived tell a story the missing ones were meant to prevent. Women of unusual height, in administrative roles, in buildings scaled to accommodate them, in a period that corresponds exactly to the final decades of whatever Tartaria actually was. And then, after 1900, nothing. The photographs stop. The administrative women disappear from the civic record. The unusual clothing vanishes. The institutional roles that were never officially named simply cease to appear in documentation, as if someone decided in a very specific decade that this particular evidence needed to stop being created. So how do you erase women from history? It turns out it's easier than erasing men, because the infrastructure was already there. Women in the 19th century didn't own property in their own names. In most jurisdictions, their legal identity was subsumed into their husbands. Their professional accomplishments were attributed to male relatives. Their institutional roles, where they existed, were categorized as assistance, support, accompaniment. If you wanted to remove women from an official record, you didn't need to destroy anything. You just needed to relabel it. The woman standing beside the architectural drawings becomes the architect's wife. The woman in institutional dress at the Civic Foundation becomes a distinguished guest. The woman of unusual stature in the administrative photograph becomes a medical curiosity, filed away, then lost. The mechanism was already built. All you had to do was use it. And here's what I keep returning to. The timing. The systematic disappearance of Tartarian women from the photographic record doesn't happen gradually. It happens in a window, roughly 1895 to 1910, that coincides exactly with the final institutional consolidation of the post-reset order. The same window when birth certificate systems were formalised, when the calendar standardisation was completed, when the last references to Tartaria vanished from encyclopedias and educational texts. It's not gradual erasure, it's a coordinated transition. As if whoever was managing the historical record understood that the women represented a specific category of evidence that needed to be reclassified before the new institutional framework was fully in place. There are orphan train records from the 1890s, and we've touched on the orphan trains before, that show a disproportionate number of female children being relocated from urban centres to rural placements with no traceable origin documentation. No birth records, no family records. Children who, in the language of the time, appeared in cities without provenance and were subsequently dispersed into the population with new names, new histories, new identities. We assume these were poor urban children, abandoned, parentless by circumstance. But what if some of them weren't? What if some of them were children whose original documentation, whose Tartarian provenance, was exactly what was being erased? Relocated not because they were abandoned, but because their existence connected to something that needed to be severed. I don't have proof of this. I want to be clear about that. What I have is a pattern, and the pattern is consistent enough that dismissing it requires more faith in coincidence than I'm currently able to sustain. There's one more thread I need to pull before I let you draw your own conclusions. The buildings. We've documented extensively the oversized proportions in Tartarian architecture. Doorways at 12 to 15 feet, staircases with risers too tall for average human comfort, interior spaces scaled beyond any reasonable aesthetic justification. But there's a specific subset of rooms within these buildings that I hadn't examined carefully until this investigation. In the administrative buildings of the 1700s and early 1800s, the ones we've identified as Tartarian construction, there are consistently rooms that official history cannot explain, smaller than the grand halls, more intimate than the ceremonial spaces, but not domestic, not decorative. Functional rooms with features that suggest professional use. Built-in storage at specific heights, window placements optimised for detailed work, surface areas calibrated for document handling. Rooms that appear in building plans but are labelled uniformly as auxiliary space or attendant quarters. In St. Petersburg's administrative complex, there are 6 such rooms on the second floor. They were converted to storage in the 1920s. Before that, the building's own records describe them as in use for administrative purposes without specifying by whom. In the original Philadelphia City Hall documentation, and this is in the public record, you can find it, there are references to the women's administrative chambers in correspondence from the 1870s. The correspondence is discussing their repurposing. The rooms existed. The people who used them existed. The decision to repurpose them coincides exactly with the window we've identified. Rooms designed for women doing administrative work in a building that, official history tells us, had no women in administrative roles. The rooms are still there. The documents are still there. The correspondence is still there. The explanation is not. And so I keep returning to the same questions. Why do women appear in administrative contexts across 5 continents in the same 4-decade window, and then disappear simultaneously after 1900? Why does the clothing in these photographs contain geometric patterns that appear identically on Tartarian architectural facades across the world? Why does the Smithsonian's own 1922 catalogue document a woman of 8-foot stature in institutional dress, and then list the photograph as lost? Why are there rooms in confirmed Tartarian buildings specifically designed for women doing administrative work, in decades when women supposedly held no administrative roles? Why do orphan train records from the 1890s show female children relocated without origin documentation in the exact window when Tartarian records were being systematically reclassified? Why does every archive in every country apply the same label, wife, companion, visitor, to women who appear in contexts that make that label obviously insufficient? And the question underneath all of it: if Tartaria employed giants as its administrative class, as the architectural evidence and the photographic record strongly suggest, then what role did the women play? Because they were there. The photographs confirm it. The rooms confirm it. The clothing confirms it. The systematic effort to reclassify and relocate and relabel confirms it. They were there. And someone decided in a very specific decade that we weren't supposed to know that. I don't have a complete picture yet. I want to be honest about that. But here's what I've learned about incomplete pictures. The frame matters as much as what's inside it. And the frame around this particular picture has been constructed very deliberately. Think about what it would take to do this. To remove a category of people from the historical record, not individuals, not specific names, but an entire functional class, you would need coordination across archival institutions in multiple countries. You would need a shared understanding of what needed to disappear and roughly when. You would need a mechanism for relabeling wife, companion, visitor, auxiliary that could be applied consistently enough to survive historical scrutiny. You would need, in other words, exactly the kind of institutional apparatus that we've been tracing throughout this series. The same apparatus that reclassified the giant skeletons, that relabeled the Tartarian buildings, that rewrote the calendar and formalised the birth certificate system and renamed the streets and repurposed the rooms. The same hands, the same window, the same method. And here's the detail that I can't stop thinking about. In every archive where I found evidence of these women, the Cincinnati Suite, the Leeds Chamber, the Russian administrative photographs, the Smithsonian catalogue entry, the reclassification happened in the same 15-year window, 1895 to 1910, not gradually, not country by country on separate timelines, simultaneously, as if someone sent a memo, as if there was a deadline, and the deadline was before the new generation grows up not knowing what came before the children who remembered become old enough to be dismissed as confused, before the buildings are renovated and the rooms repurposed and the inventory records buried deep enough in the archive that only someone looking for exactly this, for the thing that shouldn't be missing, would ever think to find them. They almost succeeded. The rooms are still there. The inventory entries are still there. The photographs are still there. The ones they didn't get to in time. The pattern on the clothing is still there, carved in stone on buildings across 4 continents, waiting for someone to ask why it also appears on the collar of a woman standing in a Cincinnati Administrative Building in 1887. She knew something. Whatever role she held, whatever institution she served, whatever the Women's Records Chamber in Leeds was actually recording, she was part of it. And they went to considerable trouble to make sure we'd never ask what it was. I keep coming back to that effort, the scale of it, the coordination, the consistency. You don't erase something that doesn't matter. You erase something that, if remembered, would change everything. The next video goes somewhere I've been avoiding for a while. I think I'm ready now. I'll see you there.